January 26, 1945. The frozen Alsatian forest floor crunched beneath Hauptmann Klaus Richter's boots as he positioned himself behind a snow-dusted oak tree, his breath forming crystalline clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. Through his field glasses, he surveyed the isolated farmhouse, 700 meters distant, its stone walls barely visible through the morning mist that clung to the Colmar Pocket like a burial shroud. Behind him, arranged in a careful crescent through the tree line, 249 men of the 198th Grenadier Division waited in the cold, their weapons ready, their faces gaunt from weeks of retreat and rationing. Richter had received intelligence that a single American soldier, perhaps wounded, perhaps simply separated from his unit during yesterday's chaotic engagement, had taken refuge in that farmhouse. It seemed almost absurd to commit so many men to such a minor objective, but his orders had been explicit. Eliminate all American presence in this sector before the morning supply convoy attempted to break through to the surrounded German forces further south. He lowered his binoculars and checked his watch. 5:47. In 13 minutes, at precisely 6, his men would advance across the open ground in 3 waves of approximately 80 men each. Richter calculated the assault would take less than 10 minutes. The American, if he was even still alive, would be overwhelmed, captured, or killed. The mathematics seemed beyond dispute. One man cannot hold against 250, not even for the few minutes it would take to cross 700 meters of frozen field and storm a 2-story farmhouse. It was, Richter thought with something approaching sympathy for his unknown adversary, simply arithmetic. What Hauptmann Richter didn't know, as he synchronized his watch with his 3 company commanders, was that the isolated American soldier in that farmhouse wasn't wounded, wasn't lost, and had no intention whatsoever of surrendering or retreating. More critically, Richter had no comprehension of what the past 3 years of American industrial mobilization had placed in that soldier's hands, no understanding of the training doctrine that had transformed that single man into a weapons system of unprecedented lethality, and no context for the logistical abundance that had followed the American army across France like an unstoppable tide of steel and ammunition. This wasn't going to be a story about bravery overcoming odds, though bravery would certainly feature. This wasn't going to be a tale of tactical genius outwitting superior numbers, though tactics would play their role. This was going to be a demonstration of something far more fundamental and far more terrifying: the crushing, systematic superiority of American industrial warfare concentrated into the hands of one properly equipped, properly trained, properly supplied soldier who understood that the building he occupied wasn't a trap, it was a fortress, and he was its garrison. What was about to unfold in the next hour wasn't combat. It was a teaching moment, written in tracer fire and high-explosive shells, about the unbridgeable gap between 2 different philosophies of war. The German army of January 1945 was an institution in collapse, though it fought with the desperate ferocity of an animal backed into a corner. The soldiers crouching in that Alsatian tree line carried carabiner 98K rifles that were magnificent pieces of engineering, each one hand-fitted, accurate to 600 meters, a weapon that would have dominated any battlefield of the previous war. But each soldier carried only 60 rounds of 7.92mm ammunition in his belt pouches, because the ammunition factories in the Ruhr were being systematically obliterated by American and British bombers. Their 2 MG-42 machine guns, positioned on the flanks of the assault formation, represented the finest light machine gun design of the war, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute with devastating effect. But each gun crew carried only 3 belts of ammunition, 900 rounds total, because every bullet had to be transported through a logistics network that was being strangled by Allied air power. The soldiers themselves were a mixture of veterans pulled from shattered divisions and raw recruits as young as 16, formed into units that bore the proud names of pre-war divisions, but contained none of their original strength. They had eaten thin potato soup for breakfast, and many wouldn't eat again until nightfall if the supply convoy made it through. Their uniforms were mismatched, their boots were wearing through, and several men suffered from the early stages of frostbite because winter clothing was being prioritized for the Eastern Front. This wasn't the Wehrmacht of 1,940 that had swept through France with motorized columns and abundant supplies. This was an army running on fumes, held together by discipline and desperation. The American soldier in that farmhouse, let's call him Private First Class James Mitchell of Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, though his name matters less than what he represented, was the product of a completely different military reality. Mitchell had enlisted in March 1942, been inducted into an army that was being constructed from the ground up, and had spent 9 months in training before he ever saw combat. Not the rushed 3-month training of German replacements, but 9 full months of progressive instruction that transformed him from a civilian into a soldier, and then from a soldier into a specialist. He had fired over 2,000 rounds of rifle ammunition during basic and advanced training, more than many German soldiers would fire in their entire military careers. He had thrown live grenades until the motion became muscle memory. He had practiced immediate action drills until his responses to contact were automatic. He had learned to operate not just his primary weapon, but every weapon in his squad, his platoon, his company. By the time he landed in North Africa in November 1942, Mitchell wasn't just familiar with violence, he was a trained professional in its application. And now, 2 years and 3 campaigns later, he was a veteran who had survived Kasserine Pass, Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and the invasion of southern France. He was alive because he was competent, careful, and lucky, and he had learned the most important lesson of industrial warfare: firepower and ammunition trump courage and numbers every single time. But Mitchell's true advantage wasn't his training or his experience, it was what he had with him in that farmhouse. Against the stone wall nearest the tree line, he had positioned a .30 caliber M1919, a 4 machine gun on its tripod, a weapon that weighed 31 pounds and could fire 400 to 600 rounds per minute out to an effective range of 1,500 yards. Next to the gun, stacked in their distinctive green metal containers, were 8 boxes of belted, 30-0, 6 ammunition, 2,000 rounds total, each box weighing 35 pounds. Mitchell had carried 1 box himself when he'd occupied the farmhouse late yesterday afternoon. The other 7 had been in the farmhouse already, part of a supply cache left by American forces during their advance through the sector 2 weeks earlier. In addition to the machine gun, Mitchell had his M1 Garand rifle with 112 rounds of 30 to 6 inches, 14 8-round clips, an M1911, a 1 pistol with 3 magazines, 6 Mark II fragmentation grenades, and 4 rifle grenades with their launching adapters. Leaning against the doorframe of the room where he'd positioned his machine gun were a bazooka and 6 M6A1 heat rockets that he'd found in the supply cache, along with 2 cases of sea rations, 5 canteens of water, and most luxuriously, a full carton of Lucky Strike cigarettes. Mitchell wasn't trapped in this farmhouse. He was occupying prepared defensive position with enough ammunition to fight a company-sized engagement and enough food and water to sustain himself for 3 days. The Germans were about to attack a logistics depot that happened to have a trained soldier operating it. The disparity in firepower wasn't immediately obvious to Hauptmann Richter because he couldn't see what Mitchell had positioned throughout the 2-story farmhouse. On the ground floor, Mitchell had placed the M1919 machine gun, covering the main approach from the tree line, with clear fields of fire across 700 meters of frozen field. The tripod mount gave him traverse across nearly 180 degrees, and he had adjusted the elevation so the beaten zone of his fire would sweep across the open ground at chest height to a man standing or running. Upstairs, at a window facing the same direction, he had pre-positioned his rifle with 3 loaded clips and a pile of grenades, giving him a fighting position to fall back to if the Germans somehow reached the ground floor. At a window facing the opposite direction, he had placed the bazooka and 3 rockets, in case German armor appeared unlikely, given that the Wehrmacht was desperately short of fuel. But Mitchell believed in being prepared. He had filled a dozen water bottles and positioned them throughout the house as fire extinguishers in case of phosphorus or incendiary attack. He had scouted and memorized every door, every window, every piece of cover inside the structure. He had identified 3 different routes for movement between floors and had pre-positioned ammunition at each fighting position. And critically, he had done all of this methodically, yesterday afternoon and evening, not in panic, because he had learned in 2 years of combat that preparation wins firefights. Mitchell wasn't hoping to survive the coming attack. He was planning to win it. At 5:58, Hauptmann Richter gave the signal, and the first wave of approximately 80 German soldiers emerged from the tree line in a disciplined skirmish line, moving at a quick walk across the frozen field. They maintained proper intervals, 5 meters between each man, and advanced with their weapons at the ready, bayonets fixed. In the thinning morning darkness, they were visible as moving shadows against the snow. Richter watched through his binoculars, counting seconds, estimating distances. At their current pace, the first wave would reach the farmhouse in approximately 4 minutes. The second wave would emerge from the tree line 30 seconds after the first wave crossed the halfway point, adding weight to the assault. The third wave would advance when the first wave reached within 100 meters of the objective, ready to exploit success or reinforce failure. It was textbook infantry assault doctrine, unchanged in fundamentals since the previous war. Sufficient numbers to overwhelm any defense, successive waves to maintain pressure, speed and aggression to minimize exposure to defensive fire. Richter had executed similar attacks a dozen times in Russia, in France, in Poland. The formula worked because mathematics and mass were on the attacker's side. 80 men with rifles could generate more firepower than 1 man with a machine gun. Simple as that. Except the mathematics of this engagement weren't simple at all. Mitchell watched the German skirmish line emerge from the tree line with professional detachment, counting men, estimating intervals, calculating 80 men in the first wave. 5 meters between each man meant the formation was approximately 400 meters wide. At a walking pace across 700 meters of open ground, they would take 5 minutes to close to effective rifle range and 7 minutes to reach the farmhouse. That gave Mitchell 7 minutes to kill or wound as many as possible, and he had 2,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition to do it. The calculus was brutally simple. 2,000 rounds divided by 7 minutes meant he could sustain nearly 300 rounds per minute for the entire engagement without running out of ammunition, and the M1919 machine gun was designed to fire 400 to 600 rounds per minute. Mitchell could theoretically pour 2,000 rounds into that field and still have his rifle, grenades, and pistol for close defense. The Germans, advancing in the open across a frozen field with no cover against a prepared position with interlocking fields of fire, weren't executing an assault. They were walking into an abattoir. And Mitchell, who had been 19 years old when he enlisted and was now 22 and felt 40, settled his shoulders against the buttstock of the machine gun, laid his thumbs on the butterfly trigger, centered his sights on the approaching mass of soldiers, and thought with weary certainty, "Here we go again." He opened fire at 600 meters. The M1919 bucked against his shoulder in its familiar rhythm, a sustained burst of 20 rounds, the metallic chatter echoing through the farmhouse and rolling across the frozen field like thunder. The tracer rounds every 5th bullet, glowing phosphorescent red, arced across the morning darkness in flat trajectories, and Mitchell watched them strike among the advancing Germans. 3 men fell in the first burst. 2 others staggered and dropped. Mitchell traversed the gun 2 degrees right and fired another burst, 15 rounds this time, and 2 more Germans went down. The remaining soldiers in the first wave did exactly what their training taught them to do. They dropped prone in the snow and began returning fire. Muzzle flashes sparked along the skirmish line as 75 carabiner 98K rifles opened up, the distinctive crack of 7.92 mm rounds splitting the cold air. Bullets struck the stone walls of the farmhouse with sharp, spanging sounds. A round whined through the window 3 feet to Mitchell's left and buried itself in the opposite wall with a meaty thunk. Mitchell ignored it all, traversed back left, and fired a 30-round burst across the prone soldiers. The beaten zone of the machine gun fire was 6 feet high at this range, meaning every bullet that passed over the frozen field was potentially lethal to anyone not completely flat against the ground. Mitchell saw men trying to crawl backward toward the tree line, saw others hugging the slight depressions in the field, saw 2 more men fall still. He changed belts. The first belt was exhausted after just 3 bursts. 80 rounds gone, and resumed firing. The second wave of 80 Germans emerged from the tree line exactly on schedule, and Hauptmann Richter realized with sudden, sick certainty that he had miscalculated catastrophically. The first wave wasn't advancing anymore. They were pinned down in the open, taking casualties, unable to move forward or back. The American wasn't firing his machine gun, in short, conserving bursts as a German gunner would have done with limited ammunition. He was firing sustained bursts, 20 and 30 rounds at a time, pouring steel into the field with mechanical precision. Richter could see the tracer fire arcing across the darkness like a bright red rope connecting the farmhouse to his dying men, could hear the unceasing chatter of the American weapon, could see the tiny figures in the snow falling still, one after another. Through his binoculars, he watched in horror as the American traversed his fire across the second wave, dropping 6 men in seconds. The remaining soldiers of the second wave went to ground immediately, adding their rifle fire to the first wave. But it made no difference. Rifle fire against stone walls meant nothing. The American was in hard cover, elevated, with clear fields of fire, and most terrifying of all, he wasn't running out of ammunition. Richter grabbed his radio operator and screamed for his artillery observer, then realized with despair that the division had only 4 tubes of 105mm ammunition left, and those were being held for the defense of the supply convoy route. There would be no artillery support. He had committed 160 men to this assault, based on the assumption that one American soldier would have limited ammunition and could be overwhelmed by mass. He had been wrong. Mitchell was firing with the methodical precision of a man who had done this before, who understood the mechanical rhythm of the M1919, who knew exactly how long he could sustain fire before the barrel overheated. Burst of 25 rounds, traverse 3 degrees. Burst of 20 rounds, traverse back. The belt fed through the gun with liquid smoothness, brass casings spilling onto the floor in a growing pile. His right thumb controlled the trigger, his left hand steadied the weapon, his shoulder absorbed the recoil, his eye tracked the tracer rounds to their impacts. First belt gone, second belt loaded, 320 rounds expended, at least 15 Germans down for certain, perhaps 20 wounded. The return fire was intensifying. Hundreds of rifle rounds were now striking the farmhouse, but stone walls 2 feet thick don't care about 7.92mm bullets. A round struck the window frame and sent splinters across Mitchell's face, cutting his cheek. He ignored it. Third belt loaded. The MG-42 on the German left flank opened up, its incredible rate of fire sounding like a buzzsaw, and Mitchell saw the tracer fire converging on his position. He ducked below the window as dozens of rounds screamed through the opening, then popped back up and put a 40-round burst directly into the area where he'd seen the MG-42's muzzle flash. The German machine gun fell silent, gun destroyed or crew killed. Mitchell neither knew nor cared. Fourth belt loaded. The sky was lightening now, dawn breaking, and Mitchell could see the field clearly. Bodies scattered across the snow, wounded men crawling, soldiers hugging the ground in abject terror of the machine gun that wouldn't stop firing. He had been shooting for maybe 4 minutes and had expended roughly 400 rounds. He had 1,600 rounds remaining. The Germans had learned nothing, because Hauptmann Richter, observing the carnage from the tree line, was now facing the most terrible decision of his military career. He had 2 choices: order the third wave to advance, throwing another 80 men into that killing field in hopes that sheer mass of bodies would eventually overwhelm the American position, or order a retreat and accept the tactical defeat. The first choice would likely result in 100+ casualties, to capture a single farmhouse occupied by a single soldier. The second choice would mean abandoning 160 men who were currently pinned in the open, unable to advance or retreat without being cut down. Richter was a professional officer, a veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who had made hard decisions before, but he had never faced anything quite like this. The Americans weren't supposed to fight like this. They were supposed to be soft, dependent on their machines, uncomfortable with violence, prone to retreating when pressed hard. Everything Richter had been told about American soldiers suggested they lacked the ideological commitment and warrior spirit of German forces. Yet the machine gun fire from that farmhouse hadn't slackened for even a moment, and Richter could see in the growing light that the snow around his men was churned into red slush. This wasn't combat. It was systematic execution, carried out with industrial efficiency. And Richter suddenly understood something that should have been obvious from the beginning. The American in that farmhouse had more ammunition than Richter's entire force combined. Mitchell was now into his sixth belt, 680 rounds expended, and he paused to assess the tactical situation. The Germans in the field had stopped advancing entirely. They were pinned, some men prone, others huddled in the slight depressions that offered micro-terrain concealment. Their return fire had decreased noticeably. Either they were running low on ammunition or their morale was breaking. Mitchell could see several clusters of men attempting to organize for a rush, but every time 3 or 4 Germans rose to their feet, he put a burst into their group and they went down. The problem with attacking a machine gun position across open ground is that the machine gun can kill you faster than you can close the distance, and the only solution is overwhelming fire superiority or heavy weapons support. The Germans had neither. Mitchell finished his scanning and opened fire again, methodically working across the field from left to right, forcing every man to hug the ground, denying them any opportunity to maneuver. 7th belt. His right shoulder was starting to ache from the sustained recoil, and his ears rang from the enclosed space, but the M1919 was performing flawlessly. American machine guns were designed for sustained fire, built with heavy barrels and robust mechanisms that could run all day if properly maintained. Mitchell had cleaned this gun yesterday, oiled it, checked the headspace and timing. It would fire until he ran out of ammunition or the barrel melted, whichever came first. At 6:11 minutes since the first wave had emerged from the tree line, Hauptmann Richter ordered the retreat. He had no choice. His men were dying in the open, unable to advance, unable even to effectively suppress the American machine gun with their rifle fire. The third wave, still in the tree line, would remain in reserve. The first and second waves would withdraw under covering fire from the remaining MG-42, and whatever rifleman could still shoot accurately. It was a humiliating decision, a tactical defeat that would need to be explained to division command, but Richter was a realist. He had committed 160 men against a single American soldier, and that American soldier was winning. The mathematics that had seemed so certain at 5:47, one man cannot hold against 250, had been demolished by a more fundamental equation. Unlimited ammunition, plus elevated position, plus clear fields of fire, equals dead attackers regardless of their numbers. Richter gave the order, and white flares arced into the dawn sky, signaling withdrawal. Mitchell saw the flares and understood their meaning. He traversed his machine gun across the field one more time, putting long bursts into any groups that were attempting to organize for movement, then watched as the Germans began crawling backward toward the tree line, dragging wounded, leaving their dead. But the engagement wasn't over, because Mitchell understood something that Hauptmann Richter was about to learn. Retreating across open ground under fire is more dangerous than advancing. Soldiers advancing toward an objective are moving with purpose, maintaining formation, focused on closing distance. Soldiers retreating are disorganized, desperate, and exposed. Mitchell let the Germans crawl back to the 400-meter line, let them think they were getting away, and then he began firing in earnest. 8th belt, 9th belt. Long, sustained bursts of 40 and 50 rounds. The M1919, cycling so fast it sounded like a continuous roar. He aimed for the clusters of men, for the groups helping wounded, for the soldiers trying to organize the retreat. Tracer fire cut across the field in brilliant red arcs, and more Germans fell. The ones still alive were now running, abandoning equipment and wounded comrades, sprinting for the tree line with the machine gun fire chasing them. Mitchell could see the panic in their movement, the primal terror of soldiers who had just learned that their training and doctrine and tactics meant nothing against industrial firepower. He burned through the 10th belt, and the 11th, his shoulders screaming with pain, his hands operating on muscle memory, and still the Germans ran. By the time the last soldier stumbled into the tree line at 6:17, 18 minutes after the first wave had stepped into that frozen field, Mitchell had expended 450 rounds of machine gun ammunition. The killing field was silent, except for the moaning of wounded. Mitchell counted 27 bodies lying motionless in the snow, saw at least a dozen more wounded men crawling or lying still, saw blood trails where the Germans had dragged casualties back to the tree line. Out of 160 men committed to the assault, at least 40 were casualties dead, wounded, or missing. The remaining 120 men were back in the tree line, stunned, demoralized, and traumatized. Mitchell himself had sustained exactly one injury, a small cut on his cheek from a wood splinter, already clotted. He had fired 1,450 rounds of machine gun ammunition in 18 minutes, an average of 80 rounds per minute, well within the sustained fire capabilities of the M1919. He still had 550 rounds of belted ammunition remaining, plus his rifle, grenades, and pistol. If the Germans wanted to try again, he was ready. He changed to a fresh belt, adjusted his position, lit a Lucky Strike cigarette with shaking hands, and waited. What Hauptmann Richter couldn't know, was that the engagement he had just experienced wasn't exceptional by American standards, it was routine. Across France and Germany in January 1945, variations of this same scene were playing out hundreds of times every week. An American squad with 2 machine guns, well supplied with ammunition, in any kind of prepared position, could routinely hold off German forces 5 or 10 times their size. The American military doctrine of 1945 was built around a simple principle: firepower substitutes for manpower. Why send 10 men with rifles when you could send 2 men with machine guns? Why risk casualties in maneuver when you could simply shoot everything that moved? The American Army had solved the tactical problem of infantry combat by drowning it in bullets. A German infantry company in January 1945 might have 5,000 rounds of ammunition available for all weapons. An American infantry company in the same period had access to 50,000 rounds or more, distributed through a logistics system that stretched back through division, corps, army, to the munitions plants in Pennsylvania and Ohio that were churning out millions of rounds every single day. Mitchell's 2,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition represented about 2 hours of production from a single American factory. The Germans were fighting the American army. They were actually fighting American industry, and industry doesn't get tired, doesn't lose morale, doesn't run out of resources until the raw materials are exhausted. The disparity extended to every aspect of the engagement. Mitchell's M1 Garand rifle, which he hadn't even needed to use yet, was a semi-automatic weapon that could fire 8 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger, then automatically eject the empty clip and be ready for reloading in 2 seconds. The German's Karabiner 98K was a magnificent bolt-action rifle that required manual cycling after every shot, an action that took approximately 3 seconds for a skilled soldier. In a 30-second firefight, Mitchell could fire 48 rounds from his Garand, while a German soldier with a K98K could fire 10. The Germans had invented the assault rifle, the SCG-44, and it was arguably the most advanced infantry weapon of the war, but they had produced only about 425,000 of them, and most were on the Eastern Front. Mitchell's division alone had 15,000 M1 Garands, and every soldier who carried one had been trained to an expert level with hundreds of rounds of practice ammunition. The American Army had taken the position that ammunition was cheaper than training time, so soldiers were taught to shoot accurately by shooting thousands of practice rounds. The Germans, starved for ammunition, trained their soldiers with wooden rifles and theory. The result was predictable. American soldiers weren't necessarily better warriors than Germans, but they were better marksmen because they'd actually practiced marksmanship. But the most overwhelming disparity was in logistics. Mitchell's 2,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition, 8 boxes weighing 280 pounds, had arrived at this remote Alsatian farmhouse through a supply chain that stretched across the Atlantic Ocean, through the port of Marseille, up the Rhône Valley, and forward through multiple echelons of supply depots. The ammunition had been manufactured in the United States, packed in waterproof containers, loaded on Liberty ships, convoyed across an ocean patrolled by U-boats, unloaded by port battalions, sorted by ordnance companies, transported by truck battalions, operating 6,000 vehicles, transferred through regimental supply points, and ultimately delivered to forward positions by supply sergeants who viewed 280 pounds of ammunition as a routine load. The entire journey from factory to farmhouse had taken approximately 6 weeks, involved thousands of personnel, consumed thousands of gallons of fuel, and was replicated millions of times across the European theatre. The American Army in Europe in January 1945 was consuming 800 tons of ammunition per day. The German Army in the West was receiving perhaps 200 tons per day, mostly shipped by rail networks that were being systematically destroyed by Allied air power. An American Infantry Division in a defensive position could count on receiving ammunition resupply within 24 hours of request. A German division in the same situation might wait a week or never receive resupply at all. This logistical disparity meant that American soldiers fought with an abundance mentality, while German soldiers fought with a scarcity mentality, and these mindsets produced radically different combat behaviors. Mitchell had opened fire at 600 meters beyond the effective range of rifle fire because he had 2,000 rounds and could afford to shoot at targets that were merely possible rather than probable. The Germans had held their fire until 400 meters because they had 60 rounds per man and couldn't waste ammunition on low-probability targets. Mitchell had fired 1,450 rounds in 18 minutes because his doctrine was to suppress and destroy enemy formations with overwhelming firepower. The Germans had fired perhaps 3,000 rounds collectively from 160 rifles because they were trying to conserve ammunition while suppressing the American position. The result was inevitable. Mitchell's abundance allowed him to dominate the engagement from start to finish, while the Germans' scarcity forced them into a losing tactical position. They couldn't suppress his machine gun because they didn't have enough ammunition to generate sufficient volume of fire. They couldn't flank him because moving in the open meant exposing themselves to his fire. They couldn't wait him out because he had more ammunition than they did. Every tactical option was closed off by the simple reality of industrial disparity. At 6:45, 28 minutes after the German retreat, Mitchell heard the rumble of diesel engines approaching from behind his position the American direction. He moved to a rear window and saw 3 M4 Sherman tanks and 2 M3 half-tracks rolling up the farm road, followed by a company of infantry in 2.5-ton trucks. The cavalry had arrived, late but welcome. Mitchell grabbed his rifle, slung it over his shoulder, and walked out of the farmhouse to meet them. A captain jumped down from the lead half-track, took one look at the corpse-strewn field beyond the farmhouse, looked at Mitchell standing there with his rifle and a cut on his cheek, and said, "What the hell happened here, Private?" Mitchell shrugged with the weary gesture of a man who had seen too much. "Germans tried to take the farmhouse, sir. Didn't work out for them." The captain walked to the edge of the field, counting bodies, then turned back to Mitchell with an expression mixing respect and disbelief. "How many were there?" Mitchell lit another cigarette. "Couple hundred, I guess. They came in 2 waves, maybe 80 men each. Pinned them down with the machine gun, they retreated. Might have been a 3rd wave in the trees, but they had sense enough not to commit." The captain was silent for a moment. "You held off 200 Germans by yourself." "It wasn't a question." Mitchell exhaled smoke. "I had a machine gun and plenty of ammunition, sir. They had rifles and not enough ammunition. Wasn't much of a fight, really. But it had been a fight. And in the tree line where Hauptmann Richter was organizing his surviving men for withdrawal, the German officer was confronting an uncomfortable truth. He had lost at least 40 men killed or seriously wounded, had perhaps 60 more men with minor wounds or injuries, and had accomplished exactly nothing. One American soldier in a farmhouse had defeated a German force of 160 men in open combat, and the only reason the casualties weren't worse was because Richter had ordered a retreat. The mathematical certainty that had seemed so obvious at 5:47 one man cannot hold against 250 had been revealed as tragically false. One man absolutely could hold against 250 if that one man had the right weapons, the right position, the right training, and most critically unlimited ammunition. Richter gathered his company commanders for a hurried conference and saw in their faces the same stunned realization he was feeling. They hadn't been defeated by tactics or courage or skill. They had been defeated by logistics, by the simple fact that the American soldier had access to more ammunition than the entire German force combined. How do you fight an enemy like that? How do you overcome an opponent who can afford to shoot 1,500 rounds in a single engagement, while your men are rationed to 60 rounds each? The answer was simple and terrible. You don't. You can't. The war was already over. The killing was just continuing out of institutional momentum. The American company secured the area around the farmhouse, evacuated German wounded, an act of mercy that struck the captured German soldiers as remarkable, since they had been told Americans shot prisoners and established a defensive perimeter. The captain, whose name was Henderson, and who had been commanding infantry companies since North Africa, walked through the farmhouse with Mitchell, examining the defensive positions, counting ammunition expenditure, making mental notes for his after-action report. In the room where Mitchell had positioned his machine gun, Captain Henderson found 1,450 spent brass casings on the floor, arranged in a pile that came up to his knees. He picked up one of the empty cartridges, still warm, and turned it over in his fingers. "You fired 1,500 rounds?" Mitchell nodded. "About that, yes, sir. Maybe more. I lost count." Henderson looked at the remaining belted ammunition, the stacked boxes, the rifle clips, the grenades. "And you still have another 500 rounds of machine gun ammunition left?" Another nod. "Yes, sir. Figured, if they tried a third time, I had enough to hold them off." Henderson was quiet for a long moment, doing calculations in his head. 1,500 rounds fired meant, at minimum, 80 German casualties, probably closer to 100 if you counted wounded, who had made it back to the tree line. That was a casualty rate of roughly 1 German per 15 rounds, which was actually excellent by machine gun standards. The Army's training manuals estimated 50 to 100 rounds per casualty in combat conditions, accounting for misses, suppression, fire, and the general chaos of battle. Mitchell had been firing at mass targets in the open, with clear fields of fire and good visibility, optimal conditions for machine gun employment, and he'd performed exactly as doctrine predicted. There was nothing exceptional about this engagement except that it had been executed by one man instead of a squad or platoon. But Captain Henderson understood, even if he couldn't quite articulate it, that Mitchell's defensive action represented something profound about the nature of the war in 1945. The American Army had solved the fundamental problem of infantry combat: how to inflict maximum casualties on the enemy while suffering minimum casualties yourself. The solution was industrial firepower, applied systematically and abundantly. Henderson had fought through North Africa, where his company had been chronically short of ammunition and had to ration machine gun fire. He had fought through Sicily, where logistics were still catching up to doctrine, and his men sometimes went into battle with limited loads. He had fought through Salerno and Anzio, where the beachheads were congested and supply was tight. But here in France, in January 1945, his company had more ammunition than it could possibly use, more rations than it could eat, more equipment than it could carry. The supply trucks came forward every day. The ammunition dumps were stocked to overflowing. And if Henderson wanted to fire 1,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition at a suspected German position, nobody questioned it. The American Army had achieved such overwhelming logistical superiority that it could afford to be prodigal with its resources. Mitchell's 1,500 rounds represented approximately $75 worth of ammunition at production, cost less than the cost of training a replacement soldier. The economics of industrial warfare meant that it was cheaper to fire 1,500 rounds than to risk even one soldier's life in close combat. The after-action reports filtered up through regiment to division to corps, and by late afternoon, Mitchell's defensive action had been noted, filed, and largely forgotten in the avalanche of combat reports coming in from across the European theatre. One PFC holding a farmhouse against 160 Germans was interesting, but it wasn't unique. On the same day, January 26, 1945, American forces across the front engaged in hundreds of similar actions, squad positions holding against company-sized attacks, platoons defeating battalion assaults, companies stopping regiment-strength forces. The pattern was consistent. Prepared American positions with adequate ammunition could hold against German forces 5, 10, sometimes 20 times their size. The German army was still dangerous, still capable of local counterattacks and stubborn defenses, but its offensive power had been systematically destroyed by the mathematics of industrial warfare. Every attack the Germans launched cost them casualties they couldn't replace, consumed ammunition they couldn't resupply, and exhausted units that couldn't be reconstituted. The American army, by contrast, grew stronger every day as more divisions arrived from the States, more ammunition came forward from the ports, more replacements filtered through the training pipeline. Time was on America's side, and every day the disparity grew larger. Hauptmann Richter's report to division headquarters was terse and factual. Assault on objective failed. 43 casualties confirmed. Enemy strength estimated at platoon level with heavy weapons support. Recommend bypassing position and continuing withdrawal to defensive lines. He didn't mention that the enemy strength had actually been one man with a machine gun, because he didn't think anyone would believe him. He had seen it with his own eyes, and he barely believed it himself. More than the casualties, more than the tactical defeat, what haunted Richter was the casual abundance of American fire. The machine gun hadn't stopped shooting for 18 minutes. 18 minutes of continuous fire, thousands of rounds, and the American hadn't run out of ammunition. How do you fight an enemy with unlimited ammunition? How do you overcome an opponent whose supply chain could deliver 2,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition to an isolated farmhouse in a remote sector of the front? The answer was that you couldn't, and Richter knew it, and every officer and soldier in the Wehrmacht knew it, even if they couldn't admit it openly. The war was lost, not on the battlefield but in the factories, in the logistics depots, in the supply chains that stretched back to the industrial heartlands of America, where production lines that had once built cars now built tanks, where factories that had made consumer goods now made ammunition, where a nation of 130 million people had mobilized its entire economy for war and was producing war material in quantities that simply overwhelmed any possible opposition. Mitchell spent the night in a barn behind the farmhouse, sleeping on straw with his rifle next to him, and woke at dawn to the smell of cooking bacon. The company had set up a field kitchen, and Mitchell joined the line of soldiers waiting for breakfast. He received a metal tray loaded with scrambled eggs made from powder, bacon, toast, coffee, and an apple. He ate mechanically, not tasting the food, his mind still processing the engagement from yesterday. He had killed maybe 20 Germans, wounded maybe 30 more, and he felt nothing about it. Not pride, not guilt, not satisfaction, just the weary acceptance of a man who had done an unpleasant job adequately. The Germans had tried to take the farmhouse, and he had stopped them, and that was that. After breakfast, he cleaned his machine gun, oiled the working parts, checked the belt feed mechanism, and repacked his equipment. A supply sergeant came by with a truck and restocked the ammunition cache in the farmhouse. 8 fresh boxes of belted, 30-06, 2,000 rounds, replacing what Mitchell had expended. The sergeant didn't comment on the expenditure, didn't ask for explanations, just checked off boxes on a form and drove away. That was the American Army in January. 1,945. Ammunition was so abundant that firing 1,500 rounds in a single engagement didn't even warrant discussion. The reality of American industrial production in 1945 was genuinely difficult for foreign observers to comprehend. The United States was producing 96,000 aircraft per year, 45,000 tanks per year, and 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition per year. That's billion, with a B, 41 billion rounds. Enough to give every German soldier on all fronts approximately 13,000 bullets each, if the Americans had wanted to. A single ammunition plant in Lake City, Missouri, was producing 4.5 million rounds of 30-06 ammunition per day, running 3 shifts, 24 hours, every single day. Mitchell's 1,500 rounds represented approximately 5 minutes of production from that one factory. The American military-industrial complex had 39 million people employed in war production, operating in factories that had been converted from civilian use with remarkable speed. The River Rouge plant in Detroit, which had built Ford automobiles before the war, was now producing B-24 bombers at a rate of 1 per hour. The Chrysler plant was making tanks. General Motors was making aircraft engines. U.S. Steel was producing armor plate. The entire American economy had been transformed into a war machine, And that machine was producing material in quantities that made European production look medieval by comparison. Germany, by contrast, was producing approximately 25,000 aircraft per year in 1945, down from 40,000 inches, 1,944 due to Allied bombing, and approximately 5,500 tanks and assault guns per year. Their small arms ammunition production had collapsed to less than 1 billion rounds per year as factories were bombed, workers were conscripted, and raw materials became scarce. A German ammunition plant running at full capacity in 1945 might produce 500,000 rounds per month. An American plant produced that much in 3 hours. The disparity wasn't just quantitative, it was qualitative. American production lines used interchangeable parts, standardized processes, and modern quality control, meaning that ammunition produced in Ohio worked perfectly in weapons manufactured in Connecticut. German production, especially by late 1944, involved an increasing amount of slave labor, working in dispersed factories, producing ammunition with inconsistent quality control. German soldiers in the field reported frequent misfires, jammed weapons, and ammunition that didn't meet specifications. American soldiers almost never encountered such problems because their ammunition was manufactured to exacting tolerances by skilled workers using modern equipment. The tactical implications of this industrial disparity were profound and extended far beyond Mitchell's engagement at the farmhouse. At the strategic level, the American army could afford to fight in a style that minimized American casualties while maximizing enemy casualties, because they had enough ammunition to suppress rather than assault, to destroy rather than capture, to obliterate rather than outmaneuver. American doctrine in 1945 called for extensive use of artillery preparation before infantry, assault bombardments that might expend 10,000 rounds of 105 mm ammunition or more before a single soldier crossed the POR line of departure. German doctrine called for similar preparations but couldn't execute them because they didn't have 10,000 rounds to expend. An American infantry division attacking a prepared German position would hammer it with artillery for hours, reducing bunkers to rubble, cutting wire, destroying weapon positions, before sending in the infantry to mop up survivors. A German division attacking an American position might get a 30-minute artillery preparation if they were lucky, and then the infantry would assault into intact defenses and suffer accordingly. At the operational level, the ammunition disparity meant that American units could sustain combat operations indefinitely, while German units were limited by their available supplies. An American infantry regiment with 3,000 men would have access to approximately 500,000 rounds of small arms ammunition stored in supply dumps that could be rapidly delivered forward. That same regiment would receive regular resupply convoys bringing fresh ammunition, rations, fuel, and equipment. A German regiment of similar size might have 100,000 rounds available, and they would receive resupply. Maybe, if the logistics system was functioning, if the rail lines hadn't been bombed, if the trucks had fuel, if the convoy wasn't intercepted by Allied aircraft. German commanders in 1945 routinely had to break off attacks, not because they were defeated tactically, but because they had literally run out of ammunition. American commanders never faced this problem. If an American unit was running low on ammunition, they radioed for resupply and trucks would arrive within hours. The contrast was stark. American units fought until the enemy was destroyed or withdrew. German units fought until they ran out of bullets. At the tactical level, the level where Mitchell had fought his engagement, the ammunition disparity meant that individual American soldiers could dominate engagements through sustained fire. Mitchell had fired 1,500 rounds because he had 2,000 rounds available, and the tactical situation called for sustained, suppressive fire. A German soldier with 60 rounds would have fired 10 or 15 rounds in the same engagement, conserving ammunition, making every shot count, because he didn't know when he would get more. This fundamental difference in mentality, abundance versus scarcity, shaped every aspect of how the two armies fought. American soldiers were trained to rely on firepower. When in doubt, shoot. Put rounds down range. Suppress the enemy. Use your ammunition to control the battlefield. German soldiers were trained to emphasize marksmanship and fire discipline. Make every shot count. Don't waste ammunition. Conserve your resources. In theory, the German approach was more militarily efficient. In practice, the American approach won firefights because suppressive fire and volume of fire matter more than individual marksmanship in modern combat. The psychological impact of this disparity was equally significant. German soldiers who survived engagements against American forces reported a consistent theme. The Americans had unlimited ammunition and would simply shoot until resistance ceased. This created a learned helplessness in German units, a sense that tactical skill and courage were irrelevant against an enemy who could drown you in bullets. Hauptmann Richter's men, withdrawing from that farmhouse in January 1945, had just learned this lesson in the most visceral way possible. They had done everything right, tactically advanced under cover of darkness, maintained proper intervals, returned fire effectively, and none of it had mattered, because the American had 2,000 rounds, and they had 60 rounds each. The next time those soldiers faced American positions, they would hesitate, would remember the machine gun fire that never stopped, would be slower to advance and quicker to retreat. This cumulative psychological impact of repeated defeats against superior firepower was eroding German combat effectiveness more rapidly than casualties alone could explain. Units that had fought bravely in Russia or Normandy were now surrendering en masse in the Rhineland, not because they lacked courage, but because they had learned that courage without ammunition was suicide. The Germans themselves recognized this disparity and attempted to address it through various means, none particularly successful. They developed the Panzerfaust, a single-shot anti-tank weapon that was cheap to produce and didn't require extensive ammunition logistics. They emphasized aggressive, close assault tactics that minimized the time spent under enemy fire. They dispersed their forces to avoid presenting concentrated targets. They dug elaborate defensive positions that could withstand sustained fire. All of these adaptations were rational responses to American firepower superiority, and all of them failed because they addressed the symptoms rather than the cause. The cause was that Germany was an industrial power of 70 million people fighting a coalition that included American industrial power of 130 million people, British production, Soviet production, and the production of every allied nation. Germany was being outproduced by a factor of 10 to 1 or worse, and no amount of tactical cleverness could overcome that fundamental disparity. Every round the Germans fired was irreplaceable. Every round the Americans fired was followed by another 10 rounds arriving tomorrow. Mitchell's engagement at the farmhouse was ultimately forgotten, buried in the avalanche of combat actions that occurred in the final months of the European War. His company commander wrote a brief commendation noting his defensive action, and Mitchell received a Bronze Star medal that arrived 6 weeks later when the fighting was over. He kept the medal in a drawer and never talked about the engagement, because what was there to say? He had operated a machine gun competently in a defensive position, which was literally his job as an infantry soldier. The fact that he had held off 160 Germans seemed to him less remarkable than the fact that he'd had 2,000 rounds of ammunition to work with. The real hero of the engagement, if there was one, wasn't Mitchell but the ammunition factory workers in Lake City, Missouri, and the truck drivers who had delivered those 8 boxes of belted 30-06 to a supply dump in Alsace, and the supply sergeants who had pushed the ammunition forward to the farmhouse. Mitchell had just been the trigger puller at the end of a logistics chain that stretched across an ocean and halfway across a continent. He was the visible edge of American industrial power, the point where manufacturing capacity transformed into battlefield lethality. The German army continued fighting until May 8, 1945, but its offensive capability had been broken long before then. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, had been Germany's last genuine attempt at strategic counterattack, and it had failed primarily because the attacking German forces ran out of fuel and ammunition. By January 1945, when Mitchell was defending his farmhouse, the German army in the west was engaged in a fighting retreat, holding positions until they became untenable, then withdrawing to the next defensive line. Every defensive stand cost ammunition the Germans couldn't replace. Every counterattack consumed stockpiles that couldn't be rebuilt. The mathematics of industrial warfare ground inexorably toward the only possible conclusion. The side with more material would win. Courage, skill, tactical acumen, military tradition, all of these factors mattered, but they mattered less than the simple question of who had more bullets. The Germans, for all their vaunted military prowess, had fewer bullets, and in modern war, that was the only statistic that mattered in the end. The story of the American soldier who held off 250 Germans for over an hour alone is, ultimately, a story about abundance overwhelming scarcity, about industrial warfare overwhelming military tradition, about logistics defeating tactics. It's a story about what happens when one nation mobilizes its entire industrial capacity for war, while its opponent's industrial capacity is systematically destroyed. It's a story about the distance between theoretical military planning and practical battlefield reality. Hauptmann Richter had made his plans based on reasonable assumptions about what one soldier could do with limited resources, and those assumptions had been catastrophically wrong because Mitchell didn't have limited resources. He had effectively unlimited resources relative to the engagement. The equation that seemed so certain one man cannot hold against 250 was only true if both sides operated under the same logistical constraints. When one side had 20 times the ammunition of the other side, the equation inverted. 250 men with rifles and limited ammunition could not dislodge one man with a machine gun and unlimited ammunition in a prepared position. And here, finally, was the revelation that German commanders across the Western Front were confronting in those final months of the war, the realization that had slowly crystallized from hundreds of engagements like Mitchell's. They weren't fighting the American army, they were fighting American industry, and industry always wins in the end. You could kill American soldiers, and the Americans would send more. You could destroy American tanks, and the factories would build more. You could shoot down American aircraft, and the production lines would replace them within days. But Germany had no answer to this avalanche of material. Their factories were bombed. Their fuel was exhausted. Their ammunition was rationed. Their logistics were collapsing. And every day the disparity grew worse, as more American material poured off the ships in France, and more German capacity was destroyed by Allied bombing. The war had been decided not at Normandy or the Bulge or the Rhine crossings, but in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh and Birmingham, in the shipyards of California and Virginia, in the ammunition plants of Missouri and Illinois. The soldiers merely enacted the verdict that industrial production had already rendered. A captured German officer, interrogated in March 1945, provided perhaps the most eloquent summary of this realization when asked about German defensive tactics against American forces. His response was recorded in an intelligence report and later filed away. You cannot stop the Americans with tactics or courage or fortifications. You can only stop them by cutting off their supplies, and their supplies cannot be cut off because they have more trucks than we have soldiers, more ammunition than we have bullets, more fuel than we have vehicles to carry it. We are fighting the American economy, and the American economy is a force of nature. It cannot be defeated. It can only be endured until it chooses to stop, or until we are completely destroyed. We have chosen the latter. The officer was a veteran of 4 years of combat, holder of the Iron Cross First Class, commander of a battalion that had been destroyed in the Ruhr Pocket. He had fought against American forces for 6 months, from the Siegfried Line to the Rhine, and he had reached the same conclusion that Hauptmann Richter had reached at that Alsatian farmhouse. The war was lost because Germany was fighting an opponent who measured military success in terms of production capacity, and Germany couldn't match that production capacity no matter how bravely their soldiers fought. In the final accounting, Mitchell's defensive action killed or wounded approximately 40 German soldiers and consumed 1,450 rounds of machine gun ammunition, plus negligible amounts of other supplies. The German attack cost the Wehrmacht 40 irreplaceable soldiers, several thousand rounds of rifle ammunition, and the complete demoralization of a 160-man formation. The exchange ratio was approximately 40 German casualties for 0 American casualties, which was unsustainable for the Wehrmacht under any circumstances. But more than the tactical victory, what mattered was the lesson. Properly equipped American soldiers in defensive positions were essentially untouchable by German forces, lacking heavy weapons and artillery support. This lesson was repeated across the Western Front in thousands of small engagements throughout the final months of the war, creating a cumulative psychological impact that shattered German morale more effectively than any single major defeat. German soldiers learned to fear American defensive positions, to hesitate before advancing, to surrender rather than assault, because they had seen too many times what happened when rifle-armed infantry attacked machine gun positions backed by unlimited ammunition. The attacks failed, the attackers died, and the Americans kept shooting until everyone was dead or retreating. The true genius of American military doctrine in World War II wasn't tactical or strategic, it was logistical and industrial. The American military understood that modern war was fundamentally a question of resources, and that the side with more resources would win if they didn't commit catastrophic errors. So American doctrine emphasized overwhelming material superiority at every level. More tanks than the enemy, more artillery than the enemy, more aircraft than the enemy, more trucks than the enemy, and above all, more ammunition than the enemy. The doctrine assumed that American soldiers wouldn't be notably better warriors than their opponents, so it compensated by making them better-equipped warriors. Mitchell wasn't a superhuman soldier. He was an adequately trained soldier with excellent equipment and abundant supplies, and that combination was enough to defeat a German force 10 times his size. This formula, adequate training plus excellent equipment plus abundant supplies, was replicated across hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, creating an army that wasn't necessarily the most skillful or the most aggressive, but was unquestionably the most lethal, because it had the most material backing it up. The story ends, as these stories must, with victory and silence. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, destroyed not by brilliant generalship or superior tactics, but by the cumulative weight of materiel that had been grinding them down for 4 years. Mitchell went home to Ohio, worked in a factory, married, had children, and died in 1983 without ever telling his family the details of his military service. The farmhouse in Alsace still stands, its stone walls bearing no markers of the engagement that occurred there. Hauptmann Richter survived the war, was held as a POW until 1947, returned to Germany, and became a teacher, never speaking publicly about his military service. The 198th Grenadier Division was destroyed in the Colmar Pocket in April 1945. Surrendering en masse to American forces, its surviving members walking into POW camps past stacks of American ammunition crates piled 10 feet high. The lesson of Mitchell's engagement that one properly equipped soldier with abundant ammunition could defeat hundreds of poorly equipped soldiers with scarce ammunition became a footnote in the grand narrative of World War II, overshadowed by major battles and strategic campaigns. But the lesson remained, encoded in military doctrine, studied in staff colleges, remembered by the soldiers who had learned it firsthand. In industrial warfare, logistics defeats tactics, abundance defeats scarcity, and the side with more bullets wins.